screen and to adapt. Dramatization Chapter 7 Learning Objectives. Compare live theater with film and describe how time, space, and language are used in each medium. Explain why it is easier to adapt a stage play to screen than to adapt a film for stage. Illustrate the role of the director in film and live theater, and identify what makes some directors auteurs. Demonstrate how settings on stage and in film can act as symbolic extensions of theme and characterization. Show how costumes and makeup are used to create aspects of character and theme, and describe how lines and color can be used to suggest psychological qualities. Describe some of the costumes and settings film studios used during the golden age of Hollywood. Many people cling to the naive belief that stage drama and film are two aspects of the same art. Only drama is live, whereas movies are recorded. Certainly, there are undeniable similarities between the two arts. Most obviously, both use action as a principal means of communication. What people do is a major source of meaning. Live theater and movies are also collaborative enterprises, involving the coordination of writers, directors, actors, and technicians. Drama and film are both social arts, exhibited before groups of people, and experienced publicly as well as individually. But films are not mere recordings of plays. The language systems of each are fundamentally different. For the most part, movies have a far broader range of techniques at their disposal. Time, space, and language. In the live theater, time is less flexible than in movies. The basic unit of construction in the theater is the scene, and the amount of dramatic time that elapses during a scene is roughly equal to the length of time it takes to perform. True, some plays traverse many years, but usually these years transpire between curtains. We're informed that it is 7 years later either by a stage direction or by the dialogue. The basic unit of construction in movies is the shot. Because the average shot lasts only 8 or 10 seconds, and can be as brief as a fraction of a second, the cinematic shot can lengthen or shorten time more subtly. Drama has to chop out huge blocks of time between the relatively few scenes and acts. Films can expand or contract time between the many hundreds of shots. Theatrical time is usually continuous. It moves forward. Temporal dislocations like the flashback are rare in the live theater, but commonplace in movies. Space in the live theater is also dependent on the basic unit of the scene. The action takes place in a unified area that has specific limits, usually defined by the proscenium arch. Drama, then, almost always deals with closed forms. We don't imagine that the action is being continued in the wings or the dressing rooms of the theater. The proscenium arch in film is the frame, a masking device that isolates objects and people only temporarily. Movies deal with a series of space fragments. Beyond the frame of a given shot, another aspect of the action waits to be photographed. A close-up of an object, for example, is generally a detail of a subsequent long shot, which will give us the context of the close-up. In the theater, it's more difficult to withhold information in this manner. In the live theater, the viewer remains in a stationary position. The distance between the audience and the stage is constant. Of course, an actor can move closer to an audience, but compared to the fluid space in the cinema, distance variation in the live theater is negligible. The film viewer, on the other hand, identifies with the camera's lens, which is not immobilized in a chair. This identification permits the viewer to move in any direction and from any distance. An extreme close-up allows us to count the lashes of an eyelid. The extreme long shot permits us to see miles in each direction. In short, the cinema allows the spectator to feel mobile. These spatial differences don't necessarily favor one medium over the other. In the live theater, space is three-dimensional, is occupied by tangible people and objects, and is therefore more lifelike. That is, our perception of space is essentially the same as in reality. The living presence of actors, with their subtle interactions, both with other actors and the audience, is impossible to duplicate in film. Movies provide us with a two-dimensional image of space and objects. and no interaction exists between the screen actors and the audience. For this reason, nudity is not so controversial an issue on the screen as in the live theater. On stage, the naked people are real, whereas in movies they're only pictures. 738. The stage player interacts with viewers, establishing a delicate rapport with each different audience. The screen player, on the other hand, is inexorably fixed on celluloid. He or she can't readjust to each audience, for the worlds of the screen and the viewer aren't connected and continuous as they are in the live theater. Movies often seem dated because acting styles can't be adjusted to newer audiences. Stage actors, on the other hand, can make even a 2,000-year-old play seem fresh and relevant, for while the words remain the same, their interpretation and delivery can always be changed to conform with contemporary acting styles. Because of the spatial differences, the viewer's participation is different in each medium. In the live theater, the audience generally must be more active. All the visual elements are provided within a given space, so the viewer must sort out what's essential from what's incidental. Disregarding for the moment the importance of language in the theater, drama is a medium of low visual saturation. That is, the audience must fill in certain meanings in the absence of visual detail. A movie audience, on the other hand, is generally more passive. All the necessary details are provided by close-ups and by edited juxtapositions. Film, then, is a medium of high visual saturation. That is, the pictures are densely detailed with information, requiring little or no filling in. Although both drama and film are eclectic arts, the theater is a narrower medium, one specializing in spoken language. Most of the meanings in the theater are found in words, which are densely saturated with information. For this reason, drama is generally considered a writer's medium. The primacy of the text makes it a special branch of literature. In the live theater, we tend to hear before we see. The film director René Clair once noted that a blind person could still grasp the essentials of most stage plays. Movies, on the other hand, are generally regarded as a visual art and the director's medium, for it is the director who creates the images. Claire observed that a deaf person could still grasp most of the essentials of a film. But these generalizations are relative. For some movies, many of the works of Orson Welles, for example, are densely saturated, both visually and orally. Because plays stress the primacy of language, one of the major problems in adapting them to the screen is determining how much of the language is necessary in a predominantly visual art like movies. George Cukor's version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, 634A, was a conservative film adaptation. Virtually all the dialogue was retained, even the exposition and purely functional speeches of no particular poetic merit. The result is a respectful but often tedious film in which the visuals merely illustrate the language. Often, images and dialogue contain the same information, producing an overblown, static quality that actually contradicts the swift sense of action in the stage play. Zeffirelli's film version of this play is much more successful, 634B. Verbal exposition was cut almost completely and replaced, just as effectively, by visual exposition. Single lines were pruned meticulously from some of the speeches where the same information could be conveyed by images. Most of the great poetry was preserved, but often with non-synchronous visuals to expand, not duplicate, the language. The essence of Shakespeare's play is found in the impulsive haste of its youthful protagonists, the domino-like swiftness of the chain of events, and the violence of much of the action. Zeffirelli heightened these characteristics by kineticizing many of the scenes. The fight sequences are often photographed with a handheld camera that lurches and swirls with the combatants as they spill onto the streets of Verona. Zeffirelli's movie, though technically less faithful to the stage script, is actually more Shakespearean in spirit than the scrupulously literal version of Cooker. Both theater and cinema are audiovisual mediums, then, but they differ in their stress of certain conventions. The two major sources of information in the live theater are action and dialogue. We observe what people do and what they say. Theatrical action is restricted primarily to objective long shots, to use a cinematic metaphor. Only fairly large actions are effective. The duel between Hamlet and Laertes, Amanda helping Laura to dress in the glass menagerie, and so on. Extreme long shot ranges, to continue the cinematic metaphor, must be stylized in the live theater. The epic battles of Shakespeare's plays would look ridiculous if staged realistically. Likewise, close-up actions would be missed by all but those in the front rows unless the actions were exaggerated and stylized by the actors. Except for the most intimate theaters, close-up actions in the live drama have to be verbalized. That is, the most subtle actions and reactions of stage characters are usually conveyed by language rather than by visual means. We know of Hamlet's attitude toward Claudius primarily through Hamlet's soliloquies and dialogue. On the close-up level of action, then, what we see on stage is often not what people do, but what they talk about doing, or what's been done. Because of these visual problems, most plays avoid actions requiring vast or minute spaces. Theatrical action is usually confined to the long and full shot range. If vast or tiny spaces are required, the theater tends to resort to unrealistic conventions, to ballets and stylized tableaux for extreme long shot actions, and to the convention of verbal articulation for close-up actions. Movies, on the other hand, can move easily among all these ranges. For this reason, the cinema often dramatizes the action that takes place on stage only, between curtains. The human being is central to the aesthetic of the theater. Words must be recited by people. Conflicts must be embodied by actors. The cinema is not so dependent on humans. The aesthetic of film is based on photography, and anything that can be photographed can be the subject matter of a movie. For this reason, adapting a play to the screen, although difficult, is hardly impossible, for much of what can be done on the stage can be duplicated on the screen. To adapt most movies to the stage, however, would be much tougher. Movies with exterior locations would be almost automatically ruled out. Of course, how could you go about adopting John Ford's epic westerns like Stagecoach? But even films with interior locations would probably be impossible to translate into theatrical terms. True, the words would present no problem, and some actions would be transferable. But how would you deal with the time and space dislocations of Richard Lester's Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night? Theme and characterization in Joseph Losey's The Servant are communicated primarily through the use of camera angles impossible to duplicate in the theater. 1198. The theme of Bergman's The Silence is conveyed primarily through images of empty corridors, doors, and windows. How could you transfer this technique to the stage? We shouldn't assume from this that the best method of adapting a play for the screen is to open it up, to substitute exterior locations for interiors. Cinema doesn't always mean extreme long shots, sweeping pans, and flashy editing. Hitchcock once observed that many film versions of plays fail precisely because the tight, compact structure of the original is lost when the film director loosens it up with inappropriate cinematic techniques, particularly when a play emphasizes a sense of confinement, either physical or psychological, and a great many of them do. The best adapters respect the spirit of the original by finding filmic equivalents. The director, in the mid-1950s, the French periodical Cahiers du Cinéma popularized the auteur theory, a view that stressed the dominance of the director in film art. According to this view, whoever controls the mise-en-scene, the medium of the story, is the true author of a movie. The other collaborators, writers, cinematographer, actors, editor, and so forth, are merely the director's technical assistants. No doubt the auteur critics exaggerated the primacy of the director, particularly in America, where many film directors were at the mercy of the Hollywood studio system, which tended to emphasize group work rather than individual expression and publicize stars rather than directors. Nevertheless, the auteur critics were essentially correct about the most artistically significant films. Even today, the most admired movies, from whatever country, tend to be directors' films. To refer to a movie as good except for its direction is as contradictory as referring to a play as good except for its script. Of course, we can enjoy a poorly directed movie or a badly written play, but what we enjoy are usually the secondary aspects of the art: a touching performance, a striking set, good acting and stylish camera work have often redeemed rubbish material. Such enjoyable elements generally represent the individual triumph of a gifted interpretive artist, actor, set designer, cinematographer, over the mediocrity of the dominant artist, the director in film, the writer in the live theater. On the stage, then, the director is essentially an interpretive artist. If we see a rotten production of King Lear, we don't dismiss Shakespeare's play, but only a specific interpretation of the play. True, the stage director creates certain patterns of movement, appropriate gestures for actors, and spatial relationships, but all of these visual elements take second place to the language of the script, which is created by the playwright. The theatrical director's relation to the text is similar to the stage actor's relation to a role. He or she can add much to what's written down, but what is contributed is usually secondary to the text itself. The stage director is a kind of go-between for the author and the production staff. That is, the director is responsible for the general interpretation of the script and usually defines the limits for the other interpretive artists, actors, designers, technicians. The director must see to it that all the production elements are harmonized and subordinated to an overall interpretation. His or her influence is stronger during rehearsals than in the actual performance. Once the curtain opens before an audience, the director is powerless to control what then takes place. On the other hand, screen directors have a good deal more control over the final product. They too dominate the pre-production activities, but unlike the stage director, the filmmaker controls virtually every aspect of the finished work as well. The degree of precision a film director can achieve is impossible on the stage, for movie directors can rephotograph people and objects until they get exactly what they want. As we have seen, films communicate primarily through moving images, and it's the director who determines most of the visual elements: the choice of shots, angles, lighting effects, filters, optical effects, framing, composition, camera movements, and editing. Furthermore, the director usually authorizes the costume and set designs and the choice of locales. The differences in control and precision can best be illustrated perhaps by examining their handling of the mise-en-scene. Stage directors are much more restricted. They must work within one stationary set per scene. All patterns of movement take place within this given area. Because this is a three-dimensional space, they have the advantage of depth as well as breadth to work with. Through the use of platforms, they can also exploit height on the stage. The theatrical director must use certain space conventions to ensure maximum clarity. Thus, with a proscenium stage, the audience pretends it's peeping into a room where one wall has been removed. Naturally, no furniture is placed against this wall, nor do players turn their backs against it for very long periods or their dialogue wouldn't be audible. If a thrust stage is used, the audience surrounds the acting area on three sides, forcing the performers to rotate their movements and speeches so that no side is neglected. In the cinema, the director converts three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional image of space. Even with defocused photography, depth is not literal, 712b. But the flat image has certain advantages. A camera can be placed virtually anywhere, so the film director is not confined to a stationary set with a given number of walls. The eye-level long shot more or less corresponds to the theatrical proscenium arch, but in movies, the close-up also constitutes a given space, in effect a cinematic roomlet with its own walls, the frame. Each shot, then, represents a new given space with different and temporary confines. Furthermore, the movable camera permits the director to rearrange the walls many times for maximum expressiveness with no sacrifice of clarity. Thus, in film, a character can enter the frame from below, from above, from any side, and from any angle. By dollying or craning, a camera can also take us into a set, permitting objects to pass by us. Because the stage director's mise-en-scene is confined to the unit of the scene, a certain amount of compromise is inevitable. He or she must combine a maximum of expressiveness with a maximum of clarity, not always an easy task. Film directors have to make fewer compromises of this sort, for they have a greater number of scenelets at their disposal. Most movies average well over 1,000 shots. The film director can give us a half-dozen shots of the same object, some emphasizing clarity, others emphasizing expressiveness. Some shots can show a character with his or her back to the camera. The soundtrack guarantees the clarity of the character's speech. A character can be photographed through an obstruction of some kind, a pane of glass or the dense foliage of a forest. Because the cinematic shot need not be lengthy, clarity can be suspended temporarily in favor of expressiveness. In adapting a stage play, the filmmaker is confronted with thousands of choices, petty and monumental. These can alter the original in ways never dreamed of by the original dramatist. Even with classic texts, a filmmaker can emphasize the psychological, the social, or the epic, because these are determined in large measure by the way space is used in movies. A filmmaker can stage the action on studio sets or in a natural setting, but the choice will significantly alter the meaning of the work. Settings and decor. In the best movies and stage productions, settings are not merely backdrops for the action, but symbolic extensions of the theme and characterization. Settings can convey an immense amount of information, especially in the cinema. Stage sets are generally less detailed than film sets, for the audience is too distant from the stage to perceive many small details. The director in this medium must generally work with fewer sets, usually one per act. Inevitably, the stage director must settle for less precision and variety than screen directors, who have virtually no limits of this kind, especially when shooting on location. Spatial considerations force stage directors to make constant compromises with their sets. If they use too much of the upstage rear area, the audience won't be able to see or hear well. If they use high platforms to give an actor dominance, they then have the problem of getting the actor back on the main level quickly and plausibly. Stage directors must also use a constant-sized space. Settings are usually confined to long shots. If they want to suggest a vast field, for example, they must resort to certain conventions. They can stage an action in such a way as to suggest that the playing area is only a small corner of the field. Or they can stylize the set with the aid of a cyclorama, which gives the illusion of a vast sky in the background. If they want to suggest a confined area, they can do so only for short periods, for an audience grows restless when actors are restricted to a small playing area for long periods. Stage directors can use vertical, horizontal, and oblique lines in a set to suggest psychological states, but these lines, or colors or objects, cannot be cut out from scenes where they are inappropriate, as they could be in a movie. The film director has far more freedom in the use of settings. Most important, of course, the cinema permits a director to shoot outdoors. An enormous advantage. The major works of a number of great directors would have been impossible without this freedom. Griffith, Eisenstein, Keaton, Kurosawa, Antonioni, Ford, De Sica, Renoir. Epic films would be virtually impossible without the extreme long shots of vast expanses of land. Other genres, particularly those requiring a degree of stylization or deliberate unreality, have been associated with the studio, musicals, horror films, and many period films. Such genres often stress a kind of magical, sealed-off universe, and images taken from real life tend to clash with these essentially claustrophobic qualities. However, these are merely generalizations. There are some westerns that have been shot mostly indoors and some musicals that have been photographed in actual locations. If a location is extravagantly beautiful, there's no reason why a romantic musical can't exploit such a setting. The Paris locations of Minnelli's Gigi are a good example of how actual locations can enhance a stylized genre. 632a. In short, it all depends on how it's done. As the French historian Georges Citadel pointed out, the dichotomy between the studio and the street, the antithesis between Lumière and Méliès, are false oppositions when one attempts to find the solution to the problems of realism and art. Films completely outside time have been shot out of doors. Completely realistic films have been shot in the studio. In set design, as in other aspects of movies, the terms realism and formalism are simply convenient critical labels. Most sets tend toward one style or the other, but few are pure examples. For instance, in The Birth of a Nation, Griffith proudly proclaims that a number of his scenes are historical facsimiles of real places and events, like Ford's Theater where Lincoln was assassinated, or the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. These scenes were modeled on actual photographs of the period. Yet Griffith's facsimiles were created in a studio. On the other hand, real locations can be exploited to create a somewhat artificial, formalistic effect. For example, in shooting 10 Days That Shook the World, Eisenstein had the Winter Palace at his disposal for several months. Yet the images in the movie are baroque, richly textured and formally complex. Although Eisenstein chose actual locations for their authenticity, they are never just picturesque backgrounds to the action. Each shot is carefully designed. Each exploits the inherent form of the setting, contributing significantly to the aesthetic impact of the sequence. Realistic or formalistic? Realism is never a simple term. In movies, it's used to describe a variety of styles. Some critics use modifiers like poetic realism, documentary realism, and studio realism to make finer distinctions. The nature of beauty in realism is also a complex issue. Beauty of form is an important component of poetic realism. The early works of Fellini, such as The Knights of Cabiria, are handsomely mounted and slightly stylized to appeal to our visual sense. Similarly, John Ford shot 9 of his westerns in Monument Valley, Utah, because of its spectacular beauty. Among other things, Ford was a great landscape artist. Many realistic films shot in the studio are also slightly stylized to exploit this incidental visual beauty. In other realistic films, beauty, in this conventional sense, plays a lesser role. A major criterion of aesthetic value in a movie like Pontcorvo's The Battle of Algiers is its deliberate roughness. The story deals with the struggle for liberation of the Algerian people from their French colonial masters. It was shot entirely in the streets and houses of Algiers. The setting is rarely exploited for its aesthetic beauty. In fact, Pontcorvo's lack of formal organization, his refusal to yield an inch in matters of style, is his principal virtue as an artist. See 127. The moral power of the materials takes precedence over formal considerations. The setting's beauty is in its truth. In films such as these, style, that is, distortion, is regarded as prettification, a form of insincerity, and therefore ugly. To the unsympathetic, the cult of realism verges on madness. But there's a method to it. For example, John Huston shot The African Queen in the Tropics because he knew he wouldn't have to worry about 1,000 little details, such as how to get the actors to sweat a lot or how to get their clothes to stick to their bodies. Spectacle films usually require the most elaborate sets. Historical reconstructions of ancient Rome or Egypt are enormously expensive to build, and they can make or break a film in this genre because spectacle is the major attraction. Expressionistic sets are usually created in the studio, where the contaminations of reality cannot penetrate. Magic, not realism, is the aim. Méliès is the prototypical example. He was called the Jules Verne of films because his feats of prestidigitation astonished the public. The first in a long line of special effects wizards, Méliès usually painted his sets, often with trompe-l'oeil perspectives to suggest depth. He combined live actors with fanciful settings to produce a dreamlike atmosphere. He used animation, miniatures, and a wide range of optical tricks, charming his audiences with vistas of imaginary realms. 4.4b. Expressionistic sets appeal to our sense of the marvelous. The work of Danilo Donati, Italy's best-known designer, is a good example. The extravagant artificiality of the sets and costumes in such movies as Fellini's Satyricon, Amarcord, and Casanova are pure products of the imagination, Fellini's as well as Donati's. The director often provided the designer with preliminary sketches, and the two artists worked closely in determining the visual design of each film. Their conjurations can be moving, as well as witty and beautiful. For example, Amarcord is a stylized reminiscence of Fellini's youth in his hometown of Rimini. The title, from the Roman dialect, means, I remember, but Fellini shot the movie in a studio, not on location. He wanted to capture feelings, not facts. Throughout the film, the townspeople feel stifled by the provincial isolation of their community. They are filled with loneliness and long for something extraordinary to transform their lives. When they hear that a mammoth luxury liner, the Rex, will pass through the ocean waters a few miles beyond the town's shore, many of these wistful souls decide to row out to sea to greet the ship. Hundreds of them crowd into every available boat and stream away from the beach like fervent pilgrims on a quest. Then they wait. Evening settles, bringing with it a thick fog. Still they wait. In one boat, Gratiska, the charming town sexbot, confides to some sympathetic friends her dissatisfaction with her life. At 30, she is still single, childless, and unfulfilled. Her heart overflows with love, yet she has never found a truly dedicated man. In the dark silence, she weeps softly over the prospect of a barren future. Midnight passes, and still the townspeople wait faithfully. Then, when most of the characters are sleeping in their fragile boats, they're wakened by a boy's shout. It's here. Like a graceful ghost ship, the light-bedecked Rex glides past in all its regal grandeur. 721. Nino Rota's rapturous music swells to a crescendo as the townspeople wave and shout joyously. Gratiska's eyes stream with tears of exhilaration and yearning while a blind accordionist asks excitedly, tell me what it looks like. Then, as mysteriously as it appeared, the phantom ship is swallowed by the fog and slips silently off into the night. During the golden age of the Hollywood studio system, each of the majors had a characteristic visual style, determined in large part by the designers at each studio. Some were called production designers, others art directors, a few simply set designers. Their job was to determine the look of each film, and they worked closely with producers and directors to ensure that the sets, decor, costumes, and photographic style were coordinated to produce a unified effect. For example, MGM specialized in glamour, luxury, and opulent production values, and its art director, Cedric Gibbons, virtually stamped each film with the Metro look. 7208. Because all the studios attempted to diversify their products as much as possible, however, their art directors had to be versatile. For instance, RKO's Van Nest Pologlace supervised the design of such diverse movies as King Kong, Top Hat, The Informer, and Citizen Kane. Paramount's Hans Dreyer began his career at Germany's famous UFA studio. He was usually at his best creating a sense of mystery and romantic fantasy, as in the films of Joseph von Sternberg. Dreyer also designed the superb Art Deco sets for Lubitsch's Trouble in Paradise. Warner Brothers art director, Anton Grot, was a specialist in grubby, realistic locales. 720b. The studio claimed that its films were torn from today's headlines. To quote from its publicity blurbs, Warner Brothers favored topical genres with an emphasis on working-class life, gangster films, urban melodramas, and proletarian musicals. Like his counterparts at other studios, however, Grod could work in a variety of styles and genres. For example, he designed the enchanting sets for A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1935. Unfortunately, There's not much else in this movie that's enchanting. Certain types of locale were in such constant demand that the studios constructed permanent backlot sets, which were used in film after film: a turn-of-the-century street, a European square, an urban slum, and so on. Of course, these were suitably altered with new furnishings to make them look different each time they were used. The studio with the largest number of backlots was MGM, although Warner, Paramount, and 20th Century Fox also boasted a considerable number of them. Not all standing sets were located close to the studio. It was cheaper to construct some outside the environs of Los Angeles, where real estate values weren't at a premium. If a movie called for a huge realistic set, like the Welsh mining village for How Green Was My Valley, it was often built miles away from the Studio 720C. Similarly, most of the studios owned western frontier towns, ranches, and Midwestern-type farms, which were located outside the Los Angeles area. What matters most in a setting is how it embodies the essence of the story material. As the British designer Robert Mallet Stevens noted, a film set, in order to be a good set, must act. Whether realistic or expressionistic, modern or ancient, it must play its part. The set must present the character before he has even appeared. It must indicate his social position, his tastes, his habits, his lifestyle, his personality. The sets must be intimately linked with the action. Settings can also be used to suggest a sense of progression in the characters. For example, in Fellini's La Strada, one of his most realistic movies, the protagonist and his simple-minded assistant are shown as reasonably happy, traveling together from town to town with their techy theatrical act. After he abandons her, he heads for the mountains. Gradually, the landscape changes. Trees are stripped of their foliage, snow and dirty slush cover the ground, the sky is a murky gray. The changing setting is a gauge of the protagonist's spiritual condition. Nature itself seems to grieve after the helpless assistant is left alone to die. On the stage, a setting is generally admired with the opening of the curtain, and then forgotten as the actors take over the center of interest. In the movies, a director can keep cutting back to the setting to remind the audience of its significance. A film can fragment a set into a series of shots, now emphasizing one aspect of a room, later another, depending on the needs of the director and finding appropriate visual analogs for thematic and psychological ideas. In Losey's The Servant, a stairway is used as a major thematic symbol. The film deals with a servant's gradual control over his master, 11-9A. Losey uses the stairway as a kind of psychological battlefield where the relative positions of the two men on the stairs give the audience a sense of who's winning the battle. Losey also uses the rails on the stairway to suggest prison bars. The master of the house is often photographed from behind these bars. Even the furniture of a room can be exploited for psychological and thematic reasons. In one of his classes, Eisenstein once discussed the significance of a table for a set. The class exercise centered on an adaptation of Balzac's novel Pere Goriot. The scene is set at a dinner table that Balzac described as circular. But Eisenstein convincingly argued that a round table is wrong cinematically, for it implies equality, with each person linked in a circle. To convey the stratified class structure of the boarding house, Eisenstein suggested the use of a long rectangular table, with the haughty mistress of the house at the head, the favored tenants close to her sides, and the lowly Goriot alone, near the base of the table. Such attention to detail often distinguishes a master of film from a mere technician, who settles for only a general effect. The setting of a movie, far more than any play, can even take over as the central interest. 724. In Kubrick's 2001, the director spends most of his time lovingly photographing the instruments of a spaceship, various space stations, and the enormous expanses of outer space itself. The few people in the movie seem almost incidental and certainly far less interesting than the real center of concern, the setting. It would be impossible to produce 2001 on stage. The materials of the film are not theatrically convertible. Kubrick's movie is a vivid illustration of Bazin's observation that the function of the cinema is to bring to light certain details that the stage would have left untreated. A systematic analysis of a set involves a consideration of the following characteristics. 1. Exterior or interior. If the set is an exterior, how does nature function as a symbolic analog to the mood, theme, or characterization? 2. Style. Is the set realistic and lifelike or stylized and deliberately distorted? Is it in a particular style, such as colonial American, Art Deco, Victorian, sleek contemporary, and so forth? 3. Studio or location. If the set is an actual location, why was it chosen? What does it say about the characters? 4. Period. What era does the set represent? 5. Class. What is the apparent income level of the owners? 6. Size. How large is the set? Rich people tend to take up more space than the poor, who are usually crowded in their living area. 7. Decoration. How is the set furnished? Are there any status symbols, oddities of taste, and the like? Is it crowded or sparsely furnished? 8. Symbolic function. What kind of overall image does the set and its furnishings project? Here costumes and makeup. In the most sensitive films and plays, costumes and makeup aren't merely frills added to enhance an illusion, but aspects of character and theme. Costumes can reveal class, self-image, even psychological states. Depending on their cut, texture, and bulk, certain costumes can suggest agitation, fastidiousness, delicacy, dignity, and so on. A costume, then, is a medium, especially in the cinema, where a close-up of a fabric can suggest information that's independent even of the wearer. Color symbolism is used by Zeffirelli in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's family, the Capulets, are characterized as aggressive parvenus. Their colors are appropriately hot reds, yellows, and oranges. Romeo's family, on the other hand, is older and perhaps more established, but in obvious decline. They are costumed in blues, deep greens, and purples. These two color schemes are echoed in the liveries of the servants of each house, which helps the audience identify the combatants in the brawling scenes. The color of the costumes can also be used to suggest change and transition. Our first view of Juliet, for example, shows her in a vibrant red dress. After she marries Romeo, her colors are in the cool blue spectrum. Line as well as color can be used to suggest psychological qualities. Verticals, for example, tend to emphasize stateliness and dignity, Lady Montague. Horizontal lines tend to emphasize earthiness and comicality, Juliet's nurse. Perhaps the most famous costume in film history is Charlie Chaplin's tramp outfit. The costume is an indication of both class and character, conveying the complex mixture of vanity and dash that makes Charlie so appealing. The mustache, derby hat, and cane all suggest the fastidious dandy. The cane is used to give the impression of self-importance as Charlie swaggers confidently before a hostile world. But the baggy trousers, several sizes too large, the oversized shoes, the too tight coat, all of these suggest Charlie's insignificance and poverty. Chaplin's view of humanity is symbolized by that costume, vain, absurd, and, finally, poignantly vulnerable. In most cases, especially period films, costumes are designed for the performers who will be wearing them. The costumer must always be conscious of the actor's body type, whether he or she is thin, overweight, tall, short, and so on, to compensate for any deficiency. If a performer is famous for a given trait, Dietrich's legs, Marilyn's bosom, Matthew McConaughey's chest, the costumer will often design the actor's clothes to highlight these attractions. Even in period films, the costumer has a wide array of styles to choose from, and his or her choice will often be determined by what the actor looks best in within the parameters defined by the milieu of the story. During the Hollywood studio era, Powerful stars often insisted on costumes and makeup that heightened their natural endowments, regardless of period accuracy. This was a practice that was encouraged by the studio bosses, who wanted their stars to look as glamorous as possible by suggesting a contemporary look. The results are usually jarring and incongruous. Even prestigious directors like John Ford gave in to this tradition of vanity. In Ford's otherwise superb Western, My Darling Clementine, 1946, which is set in a rough frontier community, actress Linda Darnell wore glamorous star makeup and a 1940s style hairdo, even though the character she was playing was a cheap Mexican saloon girl, a coy period euphemism for a prostitute. She looks as though she just stepped out of a hoity-toity beauty salon after receiving the deluxe treatment. She's groomed to within an inch of her life. In realistic contemporary stories, costumes are often bought off the rack rather than individually designed. This is especially true in stories dealing with ordinary people who buy their clothes in department stores. When the characters are lower class or poor, costumers often purchase used clothing. For example, in On the Waterfront, which deals with dock workers and other working class characters, the costumes are frayed and torn. Costumer Anna Hill Johnstone bought them in used clothing stores in the neighborhood adjoining the waterfront area. Costumes, then, represent another language system in movies, a symbolic form of communication that can be as complex and revealing as the other language systems filmmakers use. A systematic analysis of a costume includes a consideration of the following characteristics. 1. Period. What era does the costume fall into? Is it an accurate reconstruction? If not, why? 2. Class. What is the apparent income level of the person wearing the costume? 3. Sex. Does a woman's costume emphasize her femininity or is it neutral or masculine? Does a man's costume emphasize his virility or is it fussy or effeminate? 4. Age. Is the costume appropriate to the character's age or is it deliberately too youthful, dowdy, or old-fashioned? 5. Silhouette. Is the costume form-fitting or loose and baggy? 6. Fabric. Is the material coarse, sturdy, and plain, or sheer and delicate? 7. Accessories. Does the costume include jewelry, hats, canes, and other accessories? What kind of shoes? 8. Color. What are the symbolic implications of the colors? Are they hot or cool? Subdued or bright? Solids or patterns? 9. Body exposure. How much of the body is revealed or concealed? The more body revealed, the more erotic the costume. 10. Function. Is the costume meant for leisure or for work? Is it meant to impress by its beauty and splendor, or is it merely utilitarian? 11. Body attitude. What about the wearer's posture? Proud and tall, or caved in and embarrassed? 12. Image. What is the overall impression that the costume creates? Sexy, constricting, boring, gaudy, conventional, eccentric, prim, cheap-looking, elegant? Makeup in the cinema is generally subtler than on stage. The theatrical actor uses makeup primarily to enlarge his or her features so they'll be visible from long distances. On the screen, makeup tends to be more understated. Even the most delicate changes in makeup can be perceived in the cinema. Mia Farrow's pale green face in Rosemary's Baby, for example, was used to suggest the progressive corruption of her body while she is pregnant with the devil's child. In Tom Jones, Richardson used elaborate, artificial makeup on the city characters like Lady Bellaston to suggest their deceitfulness and decadence. In the 18th century comedy of manners, cosmetics are a favored source of imagery to suggest falseness and hypocrisy. The country characters, on the other hand, especially Sophie Western, are made up more naturally, without wigs, powder, and patches. Cinematic makeup is closely associated with the type of performer wearing it. In general, stars prefer makeup that tends to glamorize them. Monroe, Garbo, and Harlow usually had an ethereal quality. Marlene Dietrich probably knew more about makeup than any star of her generation. Glamour makeup, that is. 6-2A. Straight actors and actor stars are less concerned with glamour unless the characters they're playing are in fact glamorous. In an effort to submerge their own personalities, such performers often use makeup to disfigure the familiarity of their features. Brando and Olivier were particularly likely to wear false noses, wigs, and distorting cosmetics. Today, Johnny Depp loves to trash his GQ good looks. Because Orson Welles was known primarily for playing strong, domineering roles, he resorted to such tricks in makeup to maximize the differences between his roles. Non-professional players probably wear the least amount of makeup, since they're chosen precisely because of their interesting and authentic physical appearance. In exploring the dramatic aspects of a movie, we ought to ask ourselves how time, space, and language are exploited. If the film is a theatrical adaptation, was the play opened up or did the director confine the action to a limited playing area? Why? Could the movie be adapted for the stage? How prominent is the director's hand in the film? What kind of sets are used and why? What do the costumes tell us about their wearers? Is the makeup slight and realistic, or are the actors' faces totally altered cosmetically? Next chapter. Story Chapter 8. Thank you for listening. Presented by thebullyexposed.com.